our next book is Daniela Bevilacqua's From Tapas to Modern Yoga, Sadhu's Understanding of Embodied Practices. So Daniela, who you've seen all weekend so far, is an Indianist specializing in Hindu asceticism. She received her PhD in Civilizations of Africa and Asia from Sapienza University of Rome. And I don't know how she did this. She did two at once. And in anthropology from the University of Paris-Nanterre. She worked as a postdoctoral research fellow at SOAS for the ERC-funded Hatha Yoga project. And she's currently a researcher at, do you say CRIA or CRIA? CRIA, ISCTEIUL in Lisbon. She wrote Modern Hindu Traditionalism in Contemporary India, Routledge 2018, and has edited volumes and written articles on Hindu religious traditions, gender, and embodied practices. And we're about to discuss her latest book. And to do that for us is somebody who's already been mentioned several times over the course of this weekend. We're very happy to welcome Joseph S. Alter. He's the director of the Asian Studies Center and professor of anthropology at the University of Pittsburgh. In this capacity, he's co-edited a volume entitled Connecting China, Latin America and the Caribbean, Infrastructure and Everyday Life. He's also the editor of the Journal of Asian Studies. His research is on environmental health, the globalization of Asian medical knowledge, and the cultural history of yoga's development within the institutionalized structure of nature cure in contemporary India. Having published very influentially, as we have seen so far, on yoga in relation to sexuality, athleticism, and Ayurvedic medicine, he's currently studying the way in which yoga and nature cure establish an ecology of the body within the rubric of public health. His recent publications include Yoga in Modern India and Moral Materialism. There are many, many more. Capturing the Ineffable is another one. And there's as I said, an awful lot more, but because of time, we're going to stop. And I'm going to hand over to Joseph Alter with great pleasure.
Thank you so much. It's so nice to see so many familiar faces, and it's a great honor to be invited to recognize Elizabeth's groundbreaking work. And before I begin, I'll apologize. My dog is not nearly as well behaved as Vira's, and so I have exiled him from my room. But if he barges in, I apologize in advance. But I'm delighted to be here with all of you today and to have this opportunity to comment and raise some questions about Daniela Bevilacqua's forthcoming book, From Tapas to Modern Yoga, Sadhu's Understanding of Embodied Practices, published by Equinox. The book engages with the question of how Nath, Dashnami, Ramanandi, and Udasi sadhus understand the nature of their embodied ascetic practices, as these practices involve tapas and hatha yoga. The book includes a preface, an introduction, 7 chapters, and a conclusion. It's beautifully illustrated, and I strongly encourage you to get a copy as soon as it is available. The major argument, which is very significant and timely, is that we need to understand sadhus and the practices of self-discipline they engage in from the vantage point of their lived experience. Now, this may not sound remarkable or innovative, but it truly is. The reason why is that asceticism in the Hindu tradition has almost universally been analyzed from the standpoint of textualized caricature and transcendental idealization, rather than from the perspective of lived experience. Anthropologists who have studied sannyas in practice have tended to use textual sources as a theoretical philosophical baseline, and to then interpret experience in relation to this. In many ways, the French anthropologist Louis Dumont embodied this structuralist approach and set the tone for academic work in the second half of the 20th century. Louis Dumont's Homo Hierarchicus has had a profound impact on Indology in general and how scholars have understood the distinction between ritual power and world renunciation in particular. In essence, Dumont's argument is that the individual does not exist in Hindu society, but that the world renouncer, the sadhu, incarnates a kind of idealized individuality that is dramatically and performatively otherworldly. As a counterpoint, the idealized cosmic individuality of the sannyasi ultimately defines hierarchical relations and reinforces the structure of caste society. Now, needless to say, Dumont's analysis has been challenged and roundly criticized, but his powerful and very influential thesis defined how generations of scholars in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and 90s thought about world renunciation. In essence, what Bevilacqua has had to write from tapas to modern yoga at this time, precisely because of the persistent influence that Dumont's work has had on our collective conceptualization of religion in South Asia. What she has done very significantly is turn everything about world renunciation on its head. In essence, she brings renouncers of the world back into the world of their experience so we can understand them in social and cultural context. She asks not whether sadhus measure up to some abstract standard, but how we need to understand renunciation and to ask if that is what sannyas is all about in any case, in terms of what sadhus do and what they say about what they do. In other words, from tapas to modern yoga is a subtle, incisive, radical ethnography of the relationship between transcendent self-discipline, embodied spiritual practice, and soteriology. It is a deeply human and firmly grounded book in the reality of actual experience in this world, even as it reflects an orientation towards alternative realities and experiences that transcend everyday social networks and connections. One of the things that I like about Daniela's analysis and interpretation is the way in which sadhus are represented as real people rather than enlightened souls, which is not to say that they're not, but they're represented as real people. In her book, she refers to them as grassroots sadhus, in the down-to-earth sense of grass as quite distinct from ganja as a variety of grass. They live complicated lives full of adversity, contradictions, equivocations, and poignant aspirations. Since so much power tends to be vested in the mystique of world renunciation, it is intellectually liberating and refreshing to read an account such as this that questions the power of secrecy, both in the world of sadhus and the world of academics, where many have bought into the mystique in different ways. One of the distinctive features of From Tapas to Modern Yoga is the way in which Daniela artfully and intelligently engages with the problem of relativized diversity in practice without concluding, as many other scholars have done, that yoga and tapas are, in essence, open to endless interpretation and reinterpretation. She avoids the kind of reductive, spiraling generalizations by anchoring the meaning of practice in the voices and experiences of those who engage with tapas and yoga as a form of self-development. In many ways, her work pushes the boundary of who and what a sadhu is and how categorically distinctive this label is. Nevertheless, her appreciation for the reality of lived experiences provides a solid frame for the variety of interpretations that individuals give to the experiences of tapas and yoga, as tapas and yoga cross the distinctive, or cross over the distinctions of identity that signify renunciation in practice. At once richly ethnographic and grounded in a scholarly appreciation of texts and textual interpretation, From Tapas to Modern Yoga has made me aware of my own biases and preconceptions in the study of yoga. My interest in yoga stems from skepticism about the possibility of enlightenment and begins, in essence, with the question of how and why fantastical ideas come to be embodied. My fascination with so-called God-men such as Bhamaramdev stems from the way in which they perform the magic of culturally constructing reality and then live through the magic they perform until they and everyone else loses or almost loses sight of the illusion. But my own deeply rooted skepticism has prevented me from doing the obvious, which is what Daniela has done quite brilliantly. She not only takes the cultural construction of ascetic reality seriously, she asks those of us who are entangled in the web of embodied practices to make their own sense of the world they live in. It is really quite remarkable for someone who does not believe in transcendence to be brought back down to earth from belief in this disbelief, when the sadhus Daniela speaks with reveal a philosophy of lived pain through tapas and the community built around the force of tapas. In some sense, sadhus give phenomenological answers to questions concerning existential doubt, and also remind us that the sanitization of modern postural practice has involved the separation of tapas from asana and pranayama. The practice of sadhus reminds us with the jabardast force of hakt just how contrived that cultural construction of modern reality is. So with that, I do have a few questions. In fact, I've got a lot of questions, but I'm sure we won't get to all of them. So we'll just start into them. And if questions do what they're meant to do, they will just simply provoke more questions and discussion. So we'll just start with the first one and jump in from there, if that's all right. The first question is, the focus of your book is on common, or what you sometimes refer to as grassroots sadhus, who reflect on their practice of Hatha Yoga. I wonder if you could comment on the nature and extent of the difference between what the sadhus you talked with said and what we might call high-profile godmen. Actually, this was in just the previous discussion, which I thought was really very, very perceptive. But high-profile godmen, including almost anyone you can think of, ranging across the 19th and 20th century, Vivekananda, Shivananda, Sadhguru, Sri Sri, and any number of others. Contrast what they say about physical practice in relation to their understanding of the ultimate goal of yoga and what the sadhus you spoke with said. And I ask that question because in some sense they are different, but they're all sannyasis. In other words, they're engaged in asceticism. So what are the differences and what are the similarities?
Okay, great question. And first of all, thank you, Joseph, because I was about to cry when you were saying all this, because you really saw the soul of that book, that was basically sharing the human interaction that I had with these people, because for me, that is the core of ethnography, this sharing with other human beings that actually create the ethnography more than us as a worker, let's say. So first, thank you so much for that. And then about, I mean, comparing grassroots sadhus with this godman and this modern guru, I think the first distinction, of course, both of them are ascetics, but you know that the word asceticism and who is an ascetic in India, it's very much complicated. And here I can create a bridge with Elizabeth de Michaelis, because for me it was very much important, and it's part of my way of understanding the Sadhu Samaj, the Sadhu society, is who is part of what we can call neo-Hinduism and who is part of modern Hindu traditionalism. So all these kind of sadhus and sannyasin, renouncer, who actually are connected to sampradayas, traditionally sampradayas, and therefore they follow their own rules, the disciplines, and so on. And I think this makes a big difference, because I see gurus, modern gurus, belonging to neo-Hinduism, a bit more free of innovating traditions, because quite often they are self-made gurus. I mean, Shivananda was a Saraswati, of course, but I mean, he created his own lineage. And that's also why he could initiate foreigners since the very beginning. But let's say the grassroots sadhus I was working with, they are very much entangled in the life and the rules, basically, of their own parampara and their sampradaya. And so I think this makes a big difference. It doesn't mean that there is no freedom in the sadhu society, but you know, you have to follow many different rules. And the question about how they connect like physical practice and the ultimate goal of yoga, right? And it's here you see the different approach, like neo-Hinduism, where physical practice is very much part, let's say, of the practice, while in the Sadhu Samaj, in the Sadhu society, and for these sadhus I was working with, the physical part is just related to the body. So you are using, and I consider like physical part here, like mostly asana. So when you talk with sadhus about this physical approach, they will just think like, don't waste your time. I mean, you do the physical practice if your body needs that, but don't waste your time, because your practice is something else, and it's more meditation, and that is the understanding. Yoga is dhyan, yoga is meditation, and I think this also, it's visible, because if you look at the modern gurus, they teach everything to everyone, right? There's no discrimination. While in these sampradayas, and especially, again, the role of guru is so important, because will be the guru more or less deciding what kind of sadhana you are going to do. And this really brings us back also to what Shamin Black was saying this morning. Some practices are not for everyone, especially in India, and especially in the Sadhu Samaj. It's like really related to your guru. So that's why I would say the ultimate goal of yoga is something else that is not necessarily related to the physical practice. Also, because not all the sadhus, even if they do the yoga as a sadhana, not necessarily they will go through all the stages, let's say. So like asanas, or because yama and niyama is part of that. It's the discipline that you have to follow being part of the sampradaya. But then the asanas, probably they will just learn a couple of them if it is necessary. Pranayama is, of course, important, but otherwise is like more vyayam. They call it vyayam, is exercise.
Oh, that's fascinating, because I think for those of you who haven't read the book, I think this is really a key point of great value, which is listening to how the sadhus talk about postural practice in conjunction with tapas, and their orientation towards the problematization of a distinction that in other contexts has been separated out to such a degree that we tend to see them as categorically distinct. So it's really an important perspective on something that is really important, but also not visible to those of us who haven't really spent time with sadhus. Another question that came up in my mind had to do with essentially your mentioning of sadhana brought this into focus. The difference, if there is one, between personal sadhana as practice and the performance of tapas in a public context. Your focus on the sadhus in the sampradayas who go to melas and sammelans and so forth puts them in an environment where they are in public view. And you mentioned about how in some instances the sadhus who are participating in these melas have signboards that announce their particular expertise and perspective. Who is the audience, and how does the audience factor into their self-perception?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think it's also part of destroying like Dumont, let's say. And because I always think, and I think this was in the past and is in the present, the Sadhu society and the lay society are always in connections, and they both need each other. And of course, the way sadhus try to interact and create that bridge towards them can have different ways. And one of these ways is to attract the attention of devotees, of pilgrims, of, even random people walking in a mela ground. And so I really think some of these practices like tapasya, but also more difficult asanas, were and are used to capture the attention of people. And in fact, it's interesting because when you talk about asanas with sadhus, they will tell you like, don't waste your time. But then when there are people looking in this kind of environment, they will do, if they can do them, of course, the most difficult one, the most entertaining one, just to capture the attention. And I think this is part of the performance of using. You can use actually tapasya or asanas as a form of performance to attract the people. So in this case, where there is not, let's say, the intimate space of the sadhana, these are practices done for the others, I would say, because like the sadhus, the yoga sadhana occurs like in the privately, I would say, and tapasya as well. I mean, of course, if you do dhunitap, you start that like the dhunitap, you will start that in the Kumbh Mela because it starts at that time. And but sadhus tells you like, yeah, we'll do it now in front of the people, but then the real practice starts when we go back, and we can do that like on our own time, on our own ashram. So I really think there is this difference between doing these practices as part of the sadhana and just to create this bridge with the people. And so it's always on a way to interact with the lay society, because they both need each other's.
I'm going to jump in. Sorry, guys. I feel off. Yeah, this is great. But Elizabeth's got a question, so I'd like to bring her in, and then we'll come back to you. And then we have one more after that too.
Yes, hello. Sorry, just a quick question about a book that I remember reading and finding very informative, which was an anthropology of sadhus, which seems to me, and I really look forward to reading Daniela's book. It was called The Sadhus of India by Gross, a study of Indian asceticism. I was just wondering how it relates to your book and if you found it useful and valuable. Thank you.
Gross' book is like fantastic. I mean, I wish I would have done such a kind of work, because I mean, and actually I don't know where is him at, because it will be interesting to talk to him. It was very useful, especially when I was doing my PhD on the Ramanandi Sampradaya, and still is so much full of information about the Sadhu society, because Gross spent a lot of time with the Ramanandis. And so especially if one is looking for the practices and the interpretations of reality of the Ramanandi Vaishnava communities, is very informative. I think is the best. It really is the best.
My recollection is that it was valuable. I found it, I remember being struck by it being really informative and a good.
Oh yeah. I think it should be republished, re-edited, and just because this edition is is a bit is old, but I really, I mean, every time I read it, I find something new, and yeah, I love it. Yeah.
Thank you.
So we have another question from Alexander Fadi. Would you like to ask yours?
Hello. Hi, Daniela. Hi, Joseph.
Hi, Alexander.
Yeah, thank you for a fascinating presentation. Yeah, I have a quick question. So, then probably I haven't had an opportunity to read it yet, but which I do once your book will be available to me. So somewhere in your earlier works, you noted, if I'm not mistaken, that sadhus on the ground, they rarely read any texts, and that practices are based on oral instructions received from the guru. Yeah, and you also noted that there are some vernacular texts which are produced within Samapradayas, which probably these texts are closer to what is happening on the ground, because these are essentially instructions for students, but not so much work has been done yet on this text, yeah, and further research is needed. So my question about the Sanskrit textual Hatha Yoga corpus, on which so much work has been done by James Mallinson, Jason Birch, and others, and so forth. What is the relation between these texts and oral traditions on the ground? I mean, if we read texts like Dattatreya Yoga Shastra or Hatha Pradipika, are we able to get some feeling on what is really happening on the ground? Or the connection is not so much strong between oral traditions and textual traditions?
Now, I think that it's all about audience, and I think this will come out a lot today. It's really about audience. I think the practices, these Sanskrit textual sources can tell us about practices, of course, because I created in the book, you will see that the practices are there, even if you consider some vernacular sources. They are called not Hatha Yoga, for example, but you can see that they are there. And so I really think it's about audience. So the Hatha Yoga textual sources in Sanskrit, they were addressing specific audience, probably elite or kings, but someone who could actually read Sanskrit, right? Because this is the main issue, who could read Sanskrit? And on the other side, then we have vernacular sources, which perhaps do not use the same labels, let's say, but through which we can see the practices there. Like I mentioned the Gorak Bani in my book, where you actually can find like the Kechari Mudra and Vajroli and asanas and this and that scattered, hidden because of course the text is not as clear as a Sanskrit manual, a Sanskrit text, but they are present. So I think it's more related to labels. The main difference, I think it's more related to labels. It's like, and it's also creating ownership about one label over another, which in reality you don't find in vernacular sources or even among sadhus. It's like, if you call it Hatha Yoga, you call it yoga, you call it tapas, these kind of meanings can blend. Like meditation, dhyana, you can call it tapas. It depends how you do that. So it's really more fluid. I think the vernacular sources can give us more this fluidity. But yeah, more work has to be done on that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander.
I think that's it for questions for now. So Joseph, if you would like to resume, we'd love to hear more.
Sure. I've got a question actually that picks up on a related but different orientation towards the issues. Sadhus are sometimes viewed by the general public as charlatans and tricksters. David White's wonderful Sinister Yogis frames this with reference to history and textual analysis. How, if at all, did the sadhus you spoke to respond to these kinds of attitudes? I'm not even sure that they're necessarily would be aware of them, but given that it is part of the public discourse, how might they respond to those? But then turning the tables, how might they perceive practitioners of modern postural practice? Do sadhus articulate a critique of modern practitioners? You can imagine a practice in the traditional form of a not yogi performing Gunitap, thinking about Bikram Chowdhury's hot yoga. I mean, it's probably a contrived example, but it contrasts and compares an environment that suggests some interesting points of, going back to Christopher's discussion of friction. There are points of friction here in terms of the communication. So it's somewhat of an open-ended question observation, but I'd enjoy hearing your thoughts.
Yeah, it's really about frictions, because from one side, there is this critiques towards like modern postural yoga, and especially practitioners like who we would call like Yogi Raj. They see that like, oh, that is not yoga, that is asanas. So it's different. And you cannot get a soteriological goal with that. And also there is too much, and the criticism is basically there is too much attention on the physical part, too much attention on the business as well. And so there is this criticism, but at the same time, there is also participating in this world. So obviously this also depends on the age of the sadhu you are talking with, because let's say older sadhus who have done their sadhanas, they are very stable and they don't need, you know, more devotees or more followers. They will be quite strict on their understanding of modern postural yoga and these postural practices. But those who instead also interact with foreigners have a broader understanding. So, for example, and I put this in the book, there was this Dashnami making a distinction between yoga, who he learned from his guru, and yoga, who he learned from foreigners. And it's interesting because when you, especially while doing my research, I was asking about postural practices. Some sadhus were addressing me to foreigners, like, you know, if you want to learn about asanas, just go to Rishikesh, you will find a lot of foreigners, they will teach better than us about that. And so I think this is very interesting. And in fact, there are sadhus who learn asanas from foreigners, so that then they can sell themselves as a yoga guru, using the same way it is taught by lay people. And I think this is where the friction starts, but also, you know, where the fluidity is back.
No,
We do
it's
have
fascinating.
Sorry, we do have another question that's come in from Jackie. Would you like to unmute yourself?
Yes, hi. Hi, Daniela, and hi, Joseph. Lovely to see you both. I had a question about, I haven't had a chance to read your book, only your previous studies, of course, Daniela. So my question was, how in your current presentation of your work, do you capture the change and the evolution of the sadhu's world in terms of their practice and how it's evolving?
I mean, that's a very interesting question. And I would say also a little bit scary one, because what I've seen is that the sadhu samaj, the sadhu society, is changing a lot because of mobile phone, basically. And so especially youngsters are getting very much influenced on social media. And I know a couple of them that spend their days on social medias, and so capturing and getting very much influenced by that. So I really think that this could change a lot of things in the society, like the influence through the social media. And of course, the sadhu society is going to change, and is changing a lot because of the current situation in India, where there is more and more access and support by the government. And there are a lot of sadhus nowadays who are part and are linked to the Vishva Hindu Parishad, who comes from an RSS background. And they are, like, you know, infiltrating all this kind of more Hindutva approach into that. And so there are different changes occurring nowadays in the sadhu society. So it's important to, as also Joseph was said, to keep an eye open on the real people, and the fact that they are not idealized people, but they are very much part into society. They are really people engaging with politics, evolution of ideas, exchanges, and so on. Did I answer your question, Jackie? Because
yeah, that's I'm not sure whether you've included that in the book. That's what I was wondering, or is that sort of future work?
It is a bit included, not much about the political issues, because they were not on, you know, and it's also so complicated to talk about politics and sadhus in India. But in the last chapter, it is mentioned a bit this modern influences. And I mean, I'm sorry, the book was supposed to be out in May. I don't know what happened, because it's still forthcoming, but it was supposed to be out in May. So yeah, that's also why I put it in the list, because anyways.
You still count as 2024, Daniela. You're fine. You meet the criteria. So
we have one more question, Lucy, if we can squeeze someone in.
I was going to say, so I think this will probably be the last one. And yeah, we've got about 3 or 4 minutes left.
And that's from Christopher Jane Miller.
Yeah, thank you both for a wonderful discussion, and I'm really looking forward to reading the book. And I was curious, you mentioned some practices. I heard you say pranayama, I heard you say asana, and you know me, I'm always thinking about these other alternative practices. And I was wondering, what were the kind of repertoires that you're covering in your book? Are you looking at diet? Are you looking at various? What are the categories? Not to make it too long of a question.
No, there are different. I divide the. Of course, there is one chapter on tapas and tapasya, so the different kind of tapas and how fluid is the understanding of tapasya. So basically, you will realize that in the sadhu society, everything can become a form of tapasya. It depends how you do that. And then there is the part on yoga, and it's 2 chapters, and it's divided internal practices and external practices and internal practices. And there I cover like a bit of diet, and then of course asanas, pranayamas, and then kriyas, different form of kriyas, shatkarmas, and then dharana, dhyan, samadhi. Everything is there. I'm really following the structure, like Ashtanga is followed, plus a section on kriyas.
And also in that is the discussion of movement as well. In other words, the rounds of pilgrimage and moving through space in addition to consuming things and others.
Yeah.
Can we squeeze one more in, Lucy?
Yeah, I was going to say, it's really hard to stop, isn't it? Okay, last one.
So we've got a question from Vishal, if you'd like to unmute.
Hi, Daniela. Have you got anything to say on the intentions or motivations for these people becoming ascetics? I mean, if I read accounts of Christian ascetics, some have no vocation in mainstream society. So almost like asceticism is their only viable vocation. Did you find that in Indian milieu on that? Have you come across that kind of point of view?
Yeah, there is... Sorry. Oh, yeah, okay. There is a section on the book where actually I discuss the reason why people become and enter the Asampradaya sadhu society. And it really depends on at what time they decide to enter. And you see that social reasons are also there. There is this kind of trying to avoid the Indian society, the Hindu society, the pressure that is put on especially male individuals as well. For a woman to escape from that is much more complicated. And so I analyze both, like why men enter the sadhu society and also who usually as a woman can access to that. But actually, yes, it's very complicated because again, we are back with human beings. And so the reason why they can do that, it depends. And I was always, for me, and I always talk about this, 1 minute, this little guy wanted to become a sadhu because he thought that sadhus were magicians. So he got initiated into that because he wanted to become a magician. And then he realized that actually sadhus are not magicians. And so he was caught in this kind of society. But of course, then he started doing everything. But it's interesting to see how many reasons can bring a person towards that path.